Good evening and welcome to the webinar series of the Andolanjeevini gang. As you all know, this is the fifth episode, and as always, different Andolanjeevinis across the country they speak about their struggle for identity from family to fraternity, and in the process, they get personal. As always, friends, that we express our gratitude to Mr. Modi ji, who gave us our name, Andolanjeevini, in whatever form or philosophy he thought. He may have used this word as an abuse, but for us, this is a word of pride. Friends, you know that this Andolanjeevini gang, it is a very small part of the international Andolanjeevini gang for centuries who have struggled for democracy, for human rights, for gender equal pay, against gender violence, and against patriarchy. But some of us Andolanjeevinis thought that we Andolanjeevinis, as we express in different kind of fields of struggles, it may be agricultural struggle or struggle against fascism in electoral front. But we would also like to speak about our personal struggle, the struggle that we had uh, encountered the barriers, and through that we have come to the, I mean, to what we are now. So today, our Andolanjeevini, our speaker is Tara Rao. First of all, let me welcome her. Tara, welcome. And yeah, and before I give you the mic, let me give a few words about you. Over the last 3.5 decades, she moved around both physically, working mostly in Asia and Africa, and across various areas of work. She began as an architect at a time when there was an initial visibility of women architects. She then moved on to working with environment and climate with WWF, and tiring of the directionless movement of the climate negotiations, she left. She later worked on human rights with Amnesty, setting up a human rights education program, and then later moving on to being in charge of the campaigns in India, which too she quit, not quite comfortable with the presence of international and human rights organizations in countries that have their own long history of human rights struggles. She has invested in climate action on the ground, supporting and engaged in building a team based climate action endeavor. She is now working as a member of the Central Working Group of Wake Up Karnataka or Edalu Karnataka. So this is Tara. She will be getting personal today. Tara, the podium is yours.
I was 5 years old when we at the Bahari Sons bookstore in Delhi, where we lived back then, and when my mother was with the Ministry of Education. As we came out of the bookshop and I slipped back into my seat next to my mother in our black Fiat car, I slid out a book, Aesop's Fables for Children, as I recall it, from under my red checkered frock, and I showed it to my mother. She was just maneuvering the car out of the market, and with the sight of the book emerging from under my clothing, she brought the car to a screeching halt. She turned to me and quietly said, "You'll have to take that back to the man at the shop whom you didn't buy the book from." Oh, going back into the shop quite suddenly felt like an impossible task, which she sensed and said, "I'll be right here waiting for you." Having made that arduous journey to the bookshop counter and its owner, I remember getting back into the car, a slightly changed little person. It was not so much about owning up to a blunder, but more to do with discovering from the experience how I could possibly create situations by putting myself out there and quite suddenly making things significantly different for myself and others. It was my first lesson, I believe, in understanding how I give myself the opportunity to exercise choice to do things differently, or for that matter, undo them. By the way, I went to see the bookshop owner 4 decades later and he still remembered me. Growing up, when I looked around me, my mother wasn't really much of a parent in the regular sense of the term. Not a very involved parents, as they would call it. Checking on me, me to do my homework, none of that. But at the same time, she maintained a big, large presence in my life. When she passed away on the 12th of February, nearly 2 years ago now, it made me realize how much of a presence she was. And not just for the 8, 9 years we lived together in Bangalore. She filled and molded my life and me. I believe my arguing and argumentative skills found their seed at the dining table in our all woman household with my mother, my sister, and I. The topics varied, but seemed to center around theater and direction and directing plays that my mother was stooped in, to critiquing art, music, or a dance performance. Yes, while my mother dragged me since age maybe 7 or even earlier to every art exhibition, dance performance, plays, music concerts over that decade and a half, there was quite unknowingly, I think, there was a simultaneous rejigging going on inside me, at the end of which I found myself in architecture school. I think even my choice of doing architecture is somewhere linked to my mother's obsession, which she quite efficiently, by the way, passed on to me. That of, with great consistency and regularity, rearranging the furniture in our government housing home. With great consistency and regularity, mind you. Architecture took 6 years. It's interesting when I look back now that I've moved away from practicing architecture, how for me the process of designing and working out a built form seemed to open up the world in, I would say, about three basic ways. The first opening up was of having had the experience of creating a definite possibility of taking an idea or a concept to its concrete fruition, to its concreteness, to realizing it and seeing it as something concrete, not just a sketch of an idea. The second opening up for me was the simultaneous way in which I had been trained to think and work out stuff in layers. The electrical, plumbing, the structural parts of the building had to be thought through simultaneously while still thinking about the aesthetics of design. The third opening up came from an emergence of an overall worldview over the 6 years of education and how I think was beginning to see myself wanting to be part of the universe around me, how to be part of that universe around me, which, by the way, was going in the direction of a drive to do more architectural projects that were for mass use instead of buildings for individuals. Those didn't really um, attract me so much. Over the 7, 8 years that I practiced as an architect, I ended up doing much more social infrastructure work, both, basically in Nepal and Bhutan. Um, but now when I look back, I find those skills, like that of an idea needing to find concreteness, has taken up a more expanded space for me over the decades. where I have found myself repeatedly testing an idea to find the more final concrete form of a campaign or an intervention. It's a painful process. It's a struggle. Testing, failing, trial and error is not something that in our normal education system comes to us. But in architecture, we had these things called tracing papers on which you could keep reinventing the next version of your plan. And somehow that testing seemed to linger with me. It's like the work I did and still do on climate action with the Gigaton Challenge, which Bernali spoke about just briefly. This is a team based carbon reduction enterprise. It involves supporting and building dynamic approaches for teams to prototype and evolve concrete responses on the ground to restrict carbon emissions escaping into the atmosphere. That came at the end of a struggle that I had with the whole idea of addressing climate and climate justice. You see, till then, I had only had the experience of mindlessly sitting through climate negotiations, going nowhere with nothing. It was the same old cycle that I was witness to for 5 years. But this project somehow gave me hope and still gives me hope. But it still is a struggle because you're so desperately wanting action and concrete action on the ground that shows results. For me, the designing from the idea to the actual concrete rollout definitely has those architectural skills embedded in it. While thinking of bringing the whole operation into action requires that simultaneously you sort of work at this multi layered approach. The trainers, the design, what are you going to have in each session? That practice of architecture actually taught me the layered approach that I spoke about earlier. I find memories have been so powerful in building and rebuilding myself. And they feed my drive to tell and retell stories. There are many versions of the same story, mind you. And over time, they seem to change form. I find telling a story can be transforming, both for the teller and the listener, having been both, at both ends, if you like, at different times. From my memories of my mother to my memories of becoming a mother, which seem to pass quite relative ease, with no immediate shocks to the system, surprisingly. Everybody telling you, oh my God, you have no idea what's coming. The world is going to turn upside down. And surprisingly, I don't know, I was sleeping, I think. Becoming a mother was quite painless, actually, both for my husband um, and I, who were pretty chilled around the new arrival. It did, though, gradually open up my life as a space with a very different understanding of the world and the tiny person we had brought into it. A refocus on a sense of responsibility of another person, and at the same time, being and seeing him as a playmate. I loved playing with Jovan, reading to him. I was quite devastated, I remember, when he started reading on his own. As a parent, I believe I too grew up in my own way beside him. With actually, much to my delight, the world re emerging as being about much more than just myself. A story for me has segments that hold various kinds of transitions and evolution, taking a step forward to change the world, or at least seeing the possibility of changing that world, myself. Stories tend to have an element of making choices in the meaning I want to make. Why I make certain choices also reveals a certain meaning and the evolving of what I am so desperate about and have been, that sense of purpose. Sometimes it's got on my nerves actually, this sense of purpose, but just doesn't I just don't seem to be able to shake it off. My various transitions involve making decisions, going through transformation and moving forward, and still meandering. It's been a slow but steady simmering flame as an Andolanjeevini. My moving away from architecture to social justice came with a project I did in Nepal while I was living there in the mid 90s. It was about community participation in construction of schools across Nepal. And it ended up as a couple of comic book like manuals that I worked on with a classmate of mine from architecture school, who is a brilliant caricaturist, mind you. Apparently, those comic books were used to build health posts later. But unfortunately, I was only the producer of the comic book. I didn't quite see it come to fruition. I only heard stories, which of course inspired me, and I was thrilled. But those stories were important. While designing these comic books, I remember experiencing this feeling sinking in that I couldn't be a good architect without a social science background. That recognition created a real transition, suddenly in a different zone, sort of a in between twilight zone. Having finished that piece of work, I saw the need to make certain choices to further evolve a sense of purpose. There it is again, and rigor as a woman and a professional. In short, a moment of absolute, I think, confusion, disorientation, and an internal questioning. That idea of, oh, can I really create good architecture if I have no sense of the people? I don't have a way of understanding or getting a deeper sense and understanding of the people that I have to work with and build for. Anyway, I've had this pattern in my life when I sense there might be a bend in the road ahead, um, when I go back to studying. So I signed up for a master's in gender analysis and development, which was an amazing experience in so many different ways, though it meant leaving my by then 3-year-old son behind. That bit about not being a typical parent, passed down to me from my mother, was beginning to take shape. I put myself in a full time university setting, which I loved. The content around gender was feeding and informing my sense of purpose and my identity as a mother, wife, a person, a professional, and as a woman, as a citizen. Further developing that worldview that began to take shape back at architecture school 10 years before that. It was feeding that further, that worldview. I still thought, though, that the social justice angle from gender studies was going to refine me as an architect. I even did my dissertation on looking at the physical planning of refugee settlements from a gender perspective, desperately wanting to bind architecture and gender. A fairly untouched subject back then. But, sorry, to no avail. I think I actually confused people and organizations as to who I was. That confusion seemed to disrupt my very own sense of direction. With no real sense of initiative or drive from my end, I was just, at the receiving end of getting more work related to gender in development programs, both in Asia and Africa. Soon, I was more into social development, with architecture gradually going out of focus. It felt something like a carpenter going into a sociologist think tank and trying and hoping to find meaning and purpose, of both trying to fit in and being able to, uh, desperately being able to add value and a fresh perspective. It was a struggle, but it was fun finding my feet in this fresh new territory. Almost a sense of freedom, stepping out of being in the architect's world and yet thinking visually, spatially during the ongoing analytical discussions, which were more in tables and words, and I was sort of still sitting in my spatial world. The next stretch of the road took me from designer of spaces to reimagining space, community, and relationships, and falling all over again in love with design and a world of possibility, and the beginning of a calling, and giving myself the consent to go forth and discover without knowing what the outcome would be. Staying in the moment of testing, of trial and error, of failing and more learning, like struggling to design a kitchen or a school. But this time round, it was people and workshops and training and change processes for organization, which had a whole different sense of anxiety and, oh, where am I? Will I be able to? Am I visualizing this right? Have I conceptualized this process in the right way? Who am I to run this process? I'm not somebody from these parts. I'm an architect. I think spatially. Anyway, my study and work with gender analysis opened me up to myself, trying to read diverse communities, societies, whether it was a conservation and development project in Uganda or a community based self assessment of a program outcome in Nepal. I felt a sense of freedom in reconceptualizing some quite established ways of doing and assessing things. And fortunately, I was given the space to explore only because I was that odd creature. It took me into looking spatially at relationships, community dynamics, on gender and other social lines. I loved it, but I knew I loved it, but oh, was it, what was I doing? Was it something that everybody was okay with? But I loved it, and that's because I realized design or redesign of space also brought out the opportunity to change relationships, and that this was a dynamic and endless process that I could continue to learn while I endlessly tweaked, changed, pushed, redirected, you name it. It was the opening up of a sense of freedom again, but with an action driven sense of responsibility. So that was one wave. And then, as years rolled on, quite suddenly, it was time for another learning stint, believe it or not. I was off to do another study which looked at management from an environmental, social, and ethical perspective. Working with gender within the context of various development programs, I had grown I had grown to frustrate me. I experienced a persistent resistance to rethinking space and relationships. And the siloed way of thinking gender back then felt unwieldy, leading up to multiple dead ends or short term gratification, whether it was in Nepal, Vietnam, or Uganda. So it was time to study again, as I felt I needed to further stretch myself in finding ways to deal with and think about this thing called change, which I struggled with. Change that involved people, communities, organizations, and me. Although I was beginning to grow more comfortable with people and their lives, deepening my understanding of the richness of diversity, but being more open and creative about how to approach change came with my management studies. So the people bit was there, but the change bit wasn't. And somehow the way this study opened up to me, this master's program opened up to me over those 2 years, where I alternated between working. It was one of those part time things. So I was working and studying, and it was just the most wonderful mix. That it opened up a whole new chapter, a whole new way of looking at myself, my transformation, and the world's, of course, was it was just pounding at my door. And I have to tell you, it was a study that was life changing. And I responded the best I could. It just took me in a huge wave. While it challenged me to learn to be reflective of what I could do differently, that change began with me. Oh, that was a tough one. I deepened my reflective practice, and it was really like learning a new discipline and seeing myself at the center of a change process I wanted to pursue, and not to sit outside the sphere of change to point fingers at what all needs to change. So it was a new chapter. I mean, it was a whole new book, actually. My work with organizational and network wide change processes and environment and climate justice have pushed my boundaries in constantly trying to build my stamina, staying power, patience to take on the next stretch of road. I believe the light always exists at the end of the tunnel. It always does. The question is, am I always, constantly doing everything I can to keep moving towards it? That was a challenging time, though. It was a time to make a split with my past. A drastic change awaited me, or that I was creating it. I walked away from my marriage and a way of working and thinking that I had employed for the last 2 decades. I had had a wonderful 15 years in my marriage, but happy stories too have twists in them. Don't worry, we're the best of friends now. It was hard work then, though. I came back to India after 18 years to begin again on my own. I had left behind a relationship that had been an essential part of me for those 2 decades, or thereabouts. Our adopted daughter and our son bore the brunt of this, Yovan and Chandini. It is not one of those moments in my life that I have worked the hard. It is one of those moments in my life that I have worked the hardest to mend since then. With, I believe, considerable heartache and success. And I tell you, I still enjoy working at it. The more the pain, I think more the pleasure. Architecture may have allowed me to think and reimagine right down to my fingertips. Sketching, drawing, imagining, bringing it down to paper. Gender allowed for thinking on a broader, richer canvas. And the management studies and the work that followed gave me the possibility to find ways to think differently on my feet and communicate from there. When I look back, some of the key transitions I've made were: transition one was the transition from a sense of fairness to a sense of justice, a journey from childhood to adulthood. I remember when my father died, I was 7 at that time. I was very angry. I mostly felt the unfairness of it all, and I held it close to me, suppressed in my 7-year-old body, and for a very long time. Over time, I believe that obsession with fairness seemed to translate into seeking justice. It wasn't so much about me, but it had a way of opening up the space. to look around and not be so focused on oneself. Transition two was about evolving an undying sense of curiosity, living in that what if world. Design made me sustain my curiosity. The curiosity fed creativity. But from personal experience, I can say this: creativity is never at its best without courage. The courage to try, cross the line to see what happens, whether it's a campaign, whether it's figuring out how differently you can design a bathroom, to how you could re engage and work with people, communities, diversity. That, I believe, is essential to even get the first genuine taste of ultimate creativity. I don't believe I can design a home for a family or a school for a bunch of kids if I don't shelve my ideas and step into their shoes. I remember this first came alive to me when working in Bhutan on a school's program where we needed to design a model high school that could then, piece by piece, be adapted across the country. I haven't finished. Transition three was one where I moved from being a bit, I would say, you won't believe it, but a bit shy and inarticulate, to being drawn to people and collaboration. But again, based on experience, looking back, collaboration can never truly happen without compassion. Building a bond, a relationship, means giving up a bit of myself to stand in the shoes of another and then understand how that relationship can be worked at from there forward, not starting with oneself there, but starting while finding oneself in some other person's shoes. That brings to mind the work in Vietnam, where I was working with an array of actors: the Ministry of Labor, civil society organizations, workers, factory workers, private sector, to see how the government of Vietnam could play an enhanced role to further strengthen corporate social responsibility. Mind you, it's a communist country. Within the shoes and apparel sector, it was not only a diverse group, but a divergent one, bringing them closer for a common purpose that could serve them well in different ways. Well, let me just say, I got a glimpse of that, how that closeness could happen. Transition four was the transition from the idea of work to the idea to serve. This transition today lies at the core of my sense of being. What does to serve mean? To begin with, to me, it means I am a part of a much larger whole. A whole in which I see myself belong because I can see myself playing a part in reimagining, enriching, changing it. It's not just work, because it's not just providing yourself in a pre prescribed way to get a pre prescribed job done. My work currently as a campaigner with Eddelu Karnataka, Wake Up Karnataka, is my newest and most wholesome home, as it brings front and center the larger purpose, that is to serve. But none of this, any of these transitions, is possible without action. Transition is a dynamic word and it needs real action. It's all in the doing, I believe. I can't live in my head imagining things that could or couldn't happen. I need a basic plan in place to kick things off, and then it's time for action, to take over and begin the learning and evolving. Let go. Let go of that piece of paper and get down to the ground. Not easy, painful, but you have to. I do love that part, I have to say. It's so real. It's that sense of discomfort with the excitement of something that you don't know where it'll lead you. And it never lets me down in terms of stimulation, evolution, and fun. The Wake Up Karnataka campaign had a basic frame in which we, as a team and network of 112 organizations, wanted to work in a very tight time frame of a couple of months during the Karnataka elections, the state elections. The actual campaign on the ground came alive within a dynamic mode of the collective. The 2 months flew by, but what was created out of that collective creative energy to serve, and look beyond oneself presented possibilities every day. My journey so far has been about discovering what moves me, challenges me, and what arouses my passion. By jumping into things, I've been on a constant unearthing of what makes me and wakes me up in the morning, and what keeps me on my feet. And that includes, by the way, tennis and singing. That's been the basis of extending and deepening my story. And then there's the calling and drive to share my story. Try it. I've enjoyed sharing mine with you. Though, before I stop and before I shut up, I want to end by extending an invitation to you all. Do try and piece together and tell your story. Being a storyteller is also a way of being part of community. As storytelling is about sharing in a community circle. Stories give a sense of meaning and making meaning, while evolving a sense of purpose for oneself and others. So sharing each of our stories is important and even urgent. The healing power of telling our stories lives in each of our stories. Creating meaning through listening to another story creates possibilities to mend and evolve. Sharing is healing. Sharing gives and spreads meaning, and it gives expression to our unique experience, which can drive and inspire action. Sharing one's story can also hold the fear of criticism and humiliation. But crossing that line of fear into the world of possibility as to what might happen if I told my story is a line worth crossing. I invite you to see storytelling as a calling, and I hope you think of piecing yours to share with folks around you. Try it and see what happens. Thank you for listening.
It was a wonderful 38 minutes.
Oh my God, it was that long, was it?
No, it was a wonderful 38 minutes. And the philosophic journey actually you had, that you shared with us. The journey from an individual into a collective, and in by no way demeaning the individual existence. That was amazing and wonderful. So, while you were actually discussing about your uh, journey as an architect, and the gender based architecture that you thought of, so may I ask you a naive question that I
Sure.
always thought is that this is actually a gender based question, that when married couple enters a house with a double bedded room, and the architect shows all the beautiful things to them, so is there an option that after 3 decades that room can be divided into two parts, and that is very important for a woman, for her
Absolutely.
existence to live alone. So I always think that that is very important for a woman to have her
Absolutely.
own room, her own space. So nevertheless, I just wanted to ask you that, do you ever feel that uh, that the inclusiveness of today's, I mean, may I use the term feminist movement, uh, today's the inclusiveness, may I say a super inclusiveness of the today's feminist movement, is is demeaning the feminist movement itself? Do you feel like that?
I mean, the problem with the feminist movement in itself is a bit problematic, because what "the" means, and how one sits in or outside it, or feels included or excluded, itself is problematic. It's not that me being a woman with my own sense of thoughts and drives has a space, that it just can occupy its own space in its own right. The fact that I need to belong to something, and if I'm not treading that line, that I risk not belonging, itself goes against the whole idea of being a woman. That we are constantly struggling to this, of wanting to belong. We are more trying to prove to the world how we belong than being what we should be and what we can create, not just for ourselves, even beyond ourselves. And so, I I've I've sort of, toyed with this idea of whether these are useful things, and whether we should open up that space, saying, where all are these spaces where women abide in different and new ways?
Actually, that's what I meant, that the constant tug of war for a woman
Yeah.
to belong to some collective haunts her so much that probably she demeans her own individuality. That is very important, and that is to be ashamed of for a woman to exist. That individuality is a very a thing that is not to be womanly.
Yeah.
She must belong to some collective in whatever form it is.
I think it's also about, how we start addressing, this is this whole thing about change coming from us, from within. I mean, what can I do? Where do I begin with this question? Do I keep struggling with it, or do I say, all right, let me try something? And I think that this whole idea of even opening up that space to discuss this, there are very few spaces where you can actually talk about this and even test it on the ground, to actually go discovering where women have fought and succeeded and triumphed. Those are not stories that you and I hear. That you may hear it more than I do, I'm sure, Barnali. But, you know, I always wonder, my God, we are so hidden. We are hidden, not them. We are hidden from that real world. So, time
Oh,
to go out
actually,
and
I
discover.
hear much less. I hear much less because, for us, and now you are in Edelu Karnataka, it's a kind of political movement. So, that a woman has to, first of all, seek for the, what should I say, for the emancipation of the whole humanity. And that is somehow or the other posed as something just in opposite to the emancipation of the women, and we are ashamed to talk about these things today. And now my rather next question, we don't have much more time, so my next question is that uh, nowadays I feel that the um, the struggle against fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism or superstition, it has somehow or the other, it has been neglected rather consciously to to establish the super inclusiveness. As I'm talking about, I'm not terming it as inclusiveness,
Hmm.
terming it as super inclusiveness.
Hmm.
This so called super inclusiveness has somehow or the other thrown the fight against superstition, religious fundamentalism, a way back. So, do you feel the same as I do?
You know, what's happened is there's come a tipping point. We were at a point where, we were celebrating diversity and saying, yes, but we are one. Now the diversity bit is out, and we are only about one. It's a flat, one dimensional one. It's really problematic, because I belong to something that is larger than me, and I want to acknowledge and be part of it. But at the same time, I want to be me, you know. But if I'm not allowed to be me, and it's always a struggle, and I have to explain myself. First of all, as a woman, you you have to explain yourself much more than a man has to. Or even if a man makes a mistake, it's like, oh yeah, but men. No, that's what we'd say. But when it's a woman, oh my God, there is never enough explanation. It is never enough. So I just feel, there has to, we have to find a way to reclaim even our own space, as to how do we reimagine our own space as women in our diverse backgrounds. But where can we begin by saying, and there is so much inspiration around. People just quietly work at it, you know but we, and I want to include myself, we make a big hoo-ha about where are all the people who are the innovators. But I actually think it's this quiet revolution that has to begin, about acknowledging first how much is actually changing because of certain women who pick up the gauntlet and walk and make sure they don't look back. And we have to take our inspiration from them. They stimulate us. And one loves to seek out these people who, I mean, in a small remote village, to stand up and go in the opposite direction against the grain in this solitary fashion. My God, you know it's like walking the a tightrope over the ocean. You can topple at any moment because somebody will just flick to say you are no one. And we can't allow that. We want more people to, we want to join those people. We want, and at the same time, it's not this oneness business. It is about, oh, we are this entire forest ecosystem that makes who we are, the thing called a woman. We are all this.
Okay, and the last question, Tara, that we
Sure.
are all in a what should I say, in a war zone today, to reclaim our pride as Andolanjeevinis in India and may I say worldwide. So, uh, uh, in this very struggle, while as you said, the oneness and the contradiction between the oneness and the diversity, should we very stoutly and promptly uh, 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 I mean identify the backwardness of us, of me as Bornali, of you, and of that lady in that agricultural field who has I mean she is very alone but she is fighting against oppression, but the backwardness that we are still having in ourselves and which is being used by the fascists in India and worldwide. So, should we not promptly speak against them in whatever notion it is? It may not be in a very antagonistic tone, but should we not speak about them?
You know, I, I just hear me out. So I just feel that, if we are not going to convert our thoughts and ideas into action, um, there's very little, it would just get drowned out. Now, we are, and we believe we are, and I believe we are still a democracy. It may need to be reclaimed, but we still are a democracy. And I think there is a bit of a rolling plan that we all need to be part of, because I feel that if we are to make space to create the right relationships in the right spaces, the relationships between people who we elect and the people who are governed, then We have to be able to also be front and center and not spectators of a democracy. We have become that. It's also might be something to do with, we may have fought for our freedom, but we got democracy for free. And now is a time when we cannot take it as something that comes free. Now, when you look at, when I look back at the campaign in Karnataka, it is the women who, apart from many other people, there are, what is it? 47 lakh missing voters in Karnataka. Then, on top of that, there are people who don't think they are of any value and stay home and don't vote. And the whole idea that I have something to contribute and it is my valuable vote has to come back. It has to come back. And I think that is something, and that is not the end of it. That is certainly not the end of it. It is about changing the atmosphere in which we thrive as a democracy, as we begin to build the building blocks for a thriving democracy. It's only then can we start having conversations with our leaders around accountability and even teaching them what accountability means. Today, we are taken for granted. We don't stand a chance. We don't have a space where accountability is something that is there in our processes when we interact with our candidates or our MLAs and MPs. This all has to change. We have to change. We have to decide we want a different relationship with people who have taken on the responsibility to govern. And if that is so, we have to figure out how to make it happen. And that is, I believe, is to begin with the electoral process. That may be the starting point of it, because you have to create a different playing field in which you actually start playing. And then you start talking about what we deserve, what we voted people in for, and how, we begin to talk about the process of claiming accountability. It's a, we did a bit of a thing in Karnataka which began and now, has slowed down a little bit. But this whole thing about people's voice, that you can summon your MLA with a charter of demands and say, what are you going to do about it? And that is only the beginning of the story. So, we have not done those things, but that is fine. We didn't do them, but we can do them now. And we need to set the tone of what we want to call our democracy. And that we definitely can. That is in our reach. That is in the way we begin one step in forming the next to go forward. And I have to say, Banali, I truly believe this. It's not some theory business. It is that, having done a little bit in Karnataka, and I'm not saying that, some great shakes, whatever, it brought results because, there were many networks who worked on the ground. But the point of the matter is, when you connect voter to voter on the ground, which I did, I can talk about my personal experience, then it's a whole different conversation about how are we going to get back on the horse we want to ride, so that we can then start reclaiming what is ours, what we is our right, and what is their responsibility. So, yeah, I I have great hope in all of us, I
Yes,
have to
Tara.
say.
Yes. Actually, in Bengali, we have a proverb, দাঁত থাকতে দাঁতের মর্ম. That means that till we have our teeth all right in strong foothold, we don't actually know the importance of what is our
Yes.
dant. And after it starts falling out, we understand the
So true.
importance of that. So we
We're not going to
started.
let any teeth fall out, Barnali.
I have already
We're
have
going to
actually.
hold on to all of them.
Yeah. So we started this webinar series, uh, by thanking Modi ji, and I think we are also going to end today's episode by thanking him again, because he have let us understand the importance of our democracy, and when we are trying to reclaim it, after by the process, and after 2024 we certainly must. And after we reclaim it, actually we will be building up a new democracy, uh, a form we probably did not think of, that you are just talking about, discussing about the accountability and all. So thank Modi ji again for his contribution, and thank you Tara ji, thank you Tara for this wonderful episode. And friends, we are ending our episode today, and we will be meeting you in the next episode, the sixth episode. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Barnali. That was lovely. I loved chatting with you. It's not finished, okay? We
No,
continue
no, no. Of course.
when we meet next.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Thank you. Take care.